What's goody, Hot Breathiverse? Welcome back to Hot Breath Live. This is our weekly live stream we do every Tuesday on our YouTube channel. So if you're not in the know, join our email list where I will send you weekly reminders to join us every Tuesday to get your questions answered from me, sometimes my co-host Yoshi when he's not picking up his children. Today we're flying solo, but with a very special guest that just dropped a Netflix special titled Ends. Welcome to the Hot Breathiverse. Hot Breath. Ahir Shah, ladies and gentlemen. Give it up for Ahir.
Hello. Well, listen, thank you very much for having me. And I think that we can all already establish that this is my audition to take over from Yoshi.
Yes.
I will I will be the new one. It will be spectacularly inconvenient from a time zone perspective for both of us, I'm sure, over the course of what I imagine will be a long and fruitful working relationship.
Of course.
Yes, but you know, I do not yet have children, so it makes me, I'm flexible like that.
And I'll pay you on whatever that has the best exchange rate. So whatever pounds or the dollars, we'll see what comes out of that.
Yeah. Listen, we both have our stumbles.
Yeah, it was really funny to watch your Netflix special and hear you talking about politics. Because part of me was thinking, is he talking about America? Like, it's just funny how there seems to be a little bit of turmoil everywhere, perhaps.
Yeah, well, I think particularly at the time that it was recorded. So the special was now recorded, well, I guess 6 months ago, almost exactly, because it was
Wow.
mid-March, um, and it was just like there was a point where sort of every day you woke up going, "This can't continue. Surely this can't continue." And of course, like sort of one of the, I guess, advantages of the system in the UK is that when it can't continue, it doesn't have to. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
Everyone can just be like, "Yeah, listen, I think we can all agree we fucked it." And do you want everyone just have a word? We'll all have a word, and then go.
He froze.
Ah,
He froze. He's
have I
back.
returned? Right.
You're
Okay.
back.
No, that was just
Beautiful.
me. That was just me exploring my dynamic range.
That was the government telling us to change the subject, I think. I think that was
Yeah.
we were getting too inside the matrix there. They were like, "All right, let's chop it up. Let's move on, kids." But yeah, I guess that is a better way to welcome. But thank you so much for even joining and congrats on the Netflix special. I know you've done a lot of cool stuff, but Netflix feels I don't know, that feels like for us comedians kind of like the gold standard. How does it feel? We're all aspiring. How does it feel on the other side there here?
I think, listen, it is just principally very nice to be able to say, well, I've got a thing on Netflix whenever you hear someone asking whether or not you do something for a living that you have been doing for a living for a decade or more.
Right, right,
Uh,
right, right.
like, but every time, like, it's like telling people that you are a professional comedian really feels like insisting that you have a girlfriend who's not there or something like that. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's very like, no, I have an artistic career, but you don't know her. She goes to another school. Is very much the way that it goes for a very, very long time. So I suppose at the very least, there's something that you're able to point to and be like, ah, you've heard of that.
Right. Yeah, 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 yeah. And just for context, Brock Noseworthy asked, "How long have you been doing comedy?"
So I first did stand up, I guess, just over 18 years ago, when I was 15, sort of, and
Wow.
did sort of open mics in pubs, very, very rarely and intermittently, just as a sort of like weird teenage hobby. And then started doing it more when I was at university, and sort of after university was very lucky in the sense that because I grew up in London, I had this sort of 18-month period where I could say to my parents, it's like, guys, I can afford food or shelter, but not currently both. Therefore, if you would please provide the shelter element of that for a little bit. Hopefully, I can try and work something out with this. And then, yeah, so there you go. It's just a sort of, yeah, as my friend Tom calls it, a hobby that got vastly out of hand.
But 15, that's a little out of the norm. What inspired you to get on stage or even to take the leap that young?
Well, I get like so my parents were both always just super encouraging about like
Mm.
if you're interested in something, give it a go. And we always used to watch a lot of comedy as a family when I was growing up. And a big part of this that I sort of open the show with, I won't say bookend because then wouldn't that be a spoiler? But is that when I was 7, show came on the BBC called Goodness Gracious Me, which, if people haven't heard of or seen before, uh, I really would recommend. And it's something that sort of everyone in the UK has heard of this, right? It's like even if you were born after it started, you still like someone's like, oh yeah, that thing. It's just very very famous. And it originally started as a radio show, and then became this sort of like in the primetime comedy slot on the BBC, like the show, right? And this is the late 90s. You still have all of the water cooler moments and everything. Everyone's watching the same thing. Everyone's talking about it the whole time. And this was a sketch show that had 4 South Asian comedians as the central cast of this: Sanjeev Bhaskar, Meera Syal, Nina Wadia, Kulvinder Gir. Um, and this was just completely unheard of, right? Like the idea that we were, particularly at that time, like just seeing a face like that on the television in and of itself was remarkable. As a, like, you'd be wowed if there was an extra, right? And then
Hmm.
all of a sudden, these are the guys, and they're leading it, and they're funny, and they're sexy, and they're cool, and everyone's talking about them, everyone knows them, and it's just this like extraordinarily remarkable thing. And my family and I watched the first episode at my grandparents' house, and it was because they were from that generation that was this is my grandparents, very sort of, having come here as adults in the 1960s, and carrying themselves with an armor at all times, because to let something out of that armor, even often with family, was to exhibit vulnerability, and vulnerability means weakness, and weakness can be taken advantage of, and you've just had all of these things sort of like pushed down and pushed out of you, and hearing them properly laughing uh,
Hmm.
was just this staggering thing, because all of a sudden there was laughter that involved them but wasn't directed at them. It wasn't like pointing at them or going down. Like it was, hey, this is something that we could be part of. Right. And that was, yeah, a really, really staggering thing to me. And I have had the privilege since of, I've not met Nina Vadia yet, but I've met the other 3 on multiple occasions now.
Whoa.
And it's really weird because now you talk to one another as though like, and they're like, "Oh, you're our young colleague. How are you?" And I'm like, "You changed every element
Yeah.
of my entire life."
Yeah, exactly.
But, but the staggering thing is like, yeah, other British Asian comedians who you might know, like people like Nish Kumar, I know is pretty well known now at the US as well. Like we'll all talk about this as being so formative for us, and be staggered by the fact that they weren't going off like, oh, those guys did it, therefore we'll do it, or we can do it. They just
Hmm.
did it. Right. And I think that that to me is always what's most staggering, that people going for something when they didn't realize, it's almost like the presence of someone else almost gives you that permission. Uh,
Hmm.
and they didn't have that. Uh, and so the idea that they not only knocked on the door but walked through it and created this thing is, yeah, astonishing to me.
Well, what was interesting in watching your Netflix special, which everyone must go watch, it's amazing. And what was interesting one of the things that really stuck out to me was just your interpretation of the medium, I guess. I think for a long time thinking of the comedy special of just one thing, but now your special, it has an arc. It also has callbacks and structure and things, but you're not afraid to take the audience up, but then also take them down and take them into more emotional places. You really do a good job. And as someone like me who I I get uncomfortable in those moments on stage, and I don't lean into them and see what kind of just moments I can create with those emotions. I'm more of just like, I gotta get to the next thing. You really have a confidence and a way to kind of play with the audience and take them on an emotional roller coaster that I really found
Yeah.
engaging.
And I guess, you know, there's always the difference between what's what are you going to be able to do in an hour long show, or if you're out on tour and you're doing 40 minutes interval, 40 minutes, everything like the stuff that you're going to be able to do is going to inevitably be vastly different from what are you doing when you're doing three clubs on a Saturday night, shifting between them, and just, you know, you want that, you know, you want to play the right thing for the context that you find yourself in.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, to my mind, one of the interesting things, particularly having seen like American friends who've come over and done the Edinburgh Festival, is that I think that a lot of this comes from just the sort of infrastructure of the way that British comedy particularly works, which I think is, you know, is inevitably distinct from American comedy, but I think in pretty interesting ways. Um, Firstly, because the Edinburgh Festival provides this sort of focal point to people's year, and generally for quite a long time, right? Like, all right, you'll get like people who are astonishingly successful, selling out arenas all over the world, everything, and they tend not to go down, but or you know, even they might drop in for a bit, but more likely than not, they'll have spent like a decade doing the Edinburgh Festival every single year, for a month every year, right? And it rewards, like the thing that's basically required is that, right, and there's a new hour every year
Mm-hmm.
as a consequence. Um, so you're generating loads, and I think that that also plays into storytelling to a certain extent, and like the way, if you're making a new hour every year and you're looking for hooks and what's happening, and it will inevitably bleed into, well, what's been happening in your life over the previous year, um, that's gonna end up becoming part of it, and sort of affords a bit more of the sort of thing, as you say. I don't really want to call it peak and trough, but the sort of that dynamic range,
Mm-hmm.
because it's also just part of what then sets things apart. Because if, you know, someone being in a festival audience and quite possibly seeing 4 hour long shows in a day, um, it's going to be very difficult to sort of be the thing that is remembered and stands out if it's just an hour of like really gag heavy story, like, which is not to say that there's anything wrong with that, and that is a remarkable thing. If I had the talent for it, I would do it as well.
Hmm.
um, but like, so I think that a lot of it ends up coming downstream of these weird infrastructure effects that
Huh.
the UK has around Edinburgh. I also think in part because it's a really small, really densely populated country. We generally like hub and spoke on trains the entire time. You can be back in your bed. Like, if you live in London and you're not going further north than Manchester, you're pretty much going to be able to go back same night into between these pretty dense population centres, which means that, right, I'm going to be going back to that town or that city probably every 6 months. So that helps generate as well,
Mm-hmm.
inevitably. So yeah, and I think that all of those sorts of things are interesting, and I think is probably part of why, with the exception of certain comedians, like I really love what Mike Birbiglia does in terms of
Yeah.
his ability to craft narrative over an hour. But I remember the first time I listened to, so I think that the first album I listened to of his was either Sleepwalk with Me or My Girlfriend's Boyfriend. And I was just on my own listening to it through headphones, and really, really loving it. And after a while, I was like, "Oh, he's British. That's why. That's why I get like as in he happens to be American and doing this
Right,
in
right, right.
America, but stylistically, he
Uh-huh.
is like in so many ways. It feels like I am watching a super exciting British comedian at Edinburgh doing the best Edinburgh show I've ever seen.
Yeah, it's interesting to look at, especially with comedy being so big right now, of really asking yourself, how can I stand out? How can I differentiate myself from every other comedian trying to put on a show right now?
Which, and in lots of ways, I mean, that's a impossible thing to discuss because it's a internal conversation that everyone
Hmm.
ends up having, right? And I think that one of the things that I don't know, I've sort of been thinking about increasingly with regard to this show, um, and the way that I've been able to sort of encounter people and speak to people afterwards, is that there's this really fine balance it feels between obviously wanting to get that like what's particular, and what's individual and what's and then what strikes me as really interesting is that when you start drilling down into the things that feel really particular, um, and oftentimes as a consequence quite isolating, uh, right, and then start sort of discussing or exploring that sort of thing, all of a
Mm.
sudden you realize that the stuff that you felt was extraordinarily particular is perhaps not entirely universal, but is felt and shared and understood in a way broader way than you first believed that it would be. Um, and then you're like, oh right, in in searching for what's the thing that makes me a beautiful and unique snowflake, you're suddenly finding things that are relatable within that, which feels kind of paradoxical,
Hmm.
but for sure ends up happening, and I think ends up connecting heaps deeper.
Yeah, the longer I've been doing comedy, the more I'm realizing it is about finding a connection to the audience, finding a connection to your material, and then also finding a connection to the audience. And that's, I'm starting to learn that the quicker and the more of a connection I can create with an audience, it's almost like the more memorable the show is. I don't know. That's something I kind of felt recently as I am working on new stuff after releasing a special, is having that connection of the material that then translates to a connection with the audience. It's been really interesting.
Yeah, for sure. And it's, in its most basic sense, it's we've all seen and we've all been not present like in the moment. This is just like, with the best way, but like you never want to be uh doing that. And even when you see someone else do it, they don't want to be doing that, but this is the sort of thing that can happen. Um, and that's no fun for you when you're experiencing it, and it's no fun for the people watching it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Whereas, like, when you do see, and this is what I love seeing as a sort of just punter going to see things, when all of a sudden it feels like everything's just right, and it almost feels like it's like a conductor in an orchestra, right? And I feel like that, yeah, when I watch people who are just really great, and live is certainly the best for this,
For sure.
right?
Yeah, yeah,
But
yeah.
I love having that happen to me uh, when I'm in an audience watching someone who's clearly just so demonstrably present and in control of what's going on. uh,
Hmm.
and when you know that when someone's doing it right, because they'll just be like the slightest muscle, the slightest facial expression, the slightest like flick of a finger or something will all of a sudden, and that gets everyone going. And you're like, all right, right now I'm watching someone do something that, and occasionally you can see the twinkle in their eye as well when they're on stage doing this with
And
everyone
they
in the
know
room.
it.
Be like,
Yeah,
this definitely doesn't happen every time,
yeah.
but it's lovely when it does.
When you can catch that wave, yeah, it feels you're like,
Yeah.
of course, this is like when you really kill and you're like, well, duh, like, and then you bomb for three more times, like, oh, that's right, comedy will keep you humble
Yeah.
every step of the way. Uh, what I like about your comedy too is that you weave in a message with your comedy, and that's something I would like to start doing more of as I'm looking for the next chapter of my own material in my own career. So when you're trying to weave a message into laughter, do you just start with like how do you find the funny in these things, or how do you start with the serious part and then build in the funny, or kind of how do you develop these ideas?
Yeah, so I think in part, often it feels like when you're if you're trying to approach something that's a bit more sort of quote unquote serious in stand up, you sort of know what's happening because it's like you're inflating a balloon when you're going through this stuff, and it's like every so often you're like, if I don't take some air out of this balloon's gonna pop. And so that's just the joke is just going like a bit okay, and we've put ourselves a little bit more time, but I want what's happening in this balloon to be happening. So it's definitely. So I think that as long as the thing of everything being built out of jokes is
Hmm.
sort of remembered, then there's freedom just to play and explore around that. And yeah, I don't think that it's something to be shied away from because oh well, how could that be funny? How could that topic be funny? Or whatever. Like pretty much anything can. Like I don't know, or at least you could try. Um, I've certainly found like degrees of like the things that I feel always hit the sort of deepest or provoke the sort of biggest connections and sort of recognitions from people ultimately are the things that I remember initially being like, well, how could you ever talk about that or talk about because like
Oh.
what on earth like what on earth, these will occasionally be things that are quite like well it'll always be stuff that's relatively personally difficult to talk about but you realize that okay, taking this show, the story of my grandfather's life, and part of the story of my grandfather's life is always going to be the story of his death, which in many ways like it's a harrowing thing to think about, and it's often a harrowing thing to talk about when I'm doing that when I'm telling that story while doing the show. Um, but it's like, yeah, just the thought of how do I stop this balloon popping, or how do I like I want to tell this, and it's important to tell this, but you've also to an extent got to respect the medium within which you are telling it, which means you can't like there's a way of looking at a show that goes serious in some sense, where the implication becomes that oh yeah, it's funny for the first 30 minutes and then it becomes this very sad lecture, and I very much hope that that's not what ends is. It certainly like the jokes are more dense in the first half for sure, but it was important to me to still be telling this through the prism of this is a comedy show, and you want to keep, if only to create levity, to puncture, to allow a bit of breathing space, just like if only like laugh if only to exhale in certain things, and I
Mm-hmm.
want to do it too.
Yeah, and I highly recommend people go watch the special to get more context and concrete examples of what we're talking about so you can really see it in action, because it really is, as a comedian myself and just a comedy nerd, it's really a special that will leave you inspired to really stretch your own comedy and what's possible with it. So I'm so grateful that we were even able to talk about it. And Zach Newford actually has a question along these lines of you being a performer. He says, "You're a very unique performer. Any tips on how to stand out on stage?"
Mm, standing out on stage, I think that a really annoying amount of this is just practice. And I remember,
I know
like,
that's like, yeah, I know. I'll get so many comics
yeah,
asking me certain things. I was like, stage time is really important.
yeah,
Like,
yeah. You're like, it's like just the infuriating thing of like, oh, just do it several thousand times.
right,
And then
exactly. Yeah,
like,
yeah, yeah, yeah,
I remember
exactly.
it's like the first time I started learning how to cook. I was leaving my parents' house, but I wanted to be able to carry on making the sort of Gujarati food that my mum always cooked.
Uh-huh.
So I was getting her to teach me. And then I rang her a few weeks later. I was like, "Mum, I've been making all your recipes, but I can't get." And she's like, well, you'll be able to do it in about 3. And I was like, is she going to say months? And she's like, yes. Oh,
Yeah.
come on. um,
Yep.
but like, I think that there is something in that because if only because there's and I don't want to be too grandiose about this, but you know how like robots are super good at like this can do mathematics like heaps quicker than I can do mathematics, and that's why I have it on my desk at all times. In order to, but any robot that tries to do that is really bad at it,
Mm-hmm.
and it's just because like we've been doing that for firstly like as anatomically modern Homo sapiens about a quarter of a million years, and then you've been doing that without thinking your entire life, right? Pretty much since you were a baby and you first did it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, right? And therefore, to you, this is the simplest thing in the world because you have absolutely no idea how complex the processes going into it are. Right. So I think, like, I remember once watching, and by God, I've forgotten this gentleman's name, which makes me very embarrassed. But I went to see some stand up with my uncle, um, and there was something just like perceptibly different when the sort of previous acts and then the headliner came out, and when we were leaving afterwards, it was like, what was that guy? Like there was just something different almost in the air, and no one knew who he was, right? I was like, oh, he walked to the microphone like a comedian, right? And it's like
Mm.
that bit that, and I don't think that he did it with a great deal of intentionality, um, right? But and we'll all know this that at the beginning you're so like, oh, what comes after that? Like that word, and I want to get that word out. And did I remember to set that up so that I can do that afterwards? Um, and then stuff like inevitably, unless you are an intensely physical performer, stuff like physicality doesn't really come into your way of thinking, um, because you're so concerned with words, right? And I definitely, this is not
Right.
me saying that I don't do, I do this all the time,
Mm-hmm.
right? Uh, Whereas then I think that through just doing it more and more and getting a greater sense of comfort when you're doing it, like I remember just watching like one of Richard Pryor's specials back in the 70s, and and you're like, like this guy's thumb is funny. Like,
Right.
how the hell is he doing that? Right? Like, it's a what? No one can do that, right? But it's that all of a sudden because through just his sheer talent and the amount of time that he'd be doing it, and all of these sorts of things, like working in concert to make it so that literally every part of this guy was in the performance, and that was magnetic, right? And I
Yeah.
don't think that this is dependent on sort of what you look like or anything to do with identity or anything like that. In terms of the way that you stand out on stage, it's just yeah, like whenever someone isn't sort of reaching for the next line, but you can tell from their like you're getting cues from the body as to what's happening and what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
Um, right. And like one of the things that I've seen, and I hope that I'm doing it as well, but it's always much more difficult to tell about yourself than it is with friends. But I remember in Edinburgh, I went to see my friend Pierre Novelli, who's British stand-up. He's sort of South African born, grew up on the Isle of Man. Very fun sort of life story and everything. But he's just like staggeringly good. He's got a few specials on YouTube that I would really, really recommend. Um, Now, Pierre and I have known each other since we were teenagers, and we were at university together. And now we're both 33, so we've known each other a decade and a half, right? And had met each other doing stand up at uni. So that's like we've been watching each other do that the entire time, right? And the fact that like Pierre now has bits over the last few years, you sort of notice that all right, there used to be that would have been a line, and now it's just a word, and you're letting us fill in all the rest, and it's brilliant. Or the thing that used to like it might have been a hanging word, and now it's just a glance, and that's done
Hmm.
everything for
Mm-hmm.
us. And I think that that's a really good way that he stands out on stage, uh, certainly, and it comes from he's got such a great like, stillness and presence in his body, um, and a lot of that is yeah he doesn't do any more work than he needs to, so that when he really puts the work in into like the contortions of his face or something like that, it hits to such a huge extent, um, right? And you might say sometimes this. I'm not saying that the questioner is saying this, but I guess a lot of people, quite understandably, to be fair, who might be most stand-up comedians are white men, right? It would be a more natural thing to feel like, how do I stand out from the pack when I'm a white man,
Hmm.
right? And Pierre's a white man, right? And his not only like the nature of what he's doing with his face and his hands and just everything about the way that he carries himself, everything that is standing out to me. Like also, of course, the material, uh,
Yeah.
everything,
But it comes
which
back to
speaks for
what's
itself.
unique about him as well. Kind of like we talked
Mm,
about with sources of material, talking about things unique to you, similar to the performance and your physicality. What's unique about you that you could start to tap into intentionally, I would say as well. I think if Zach is asking how to stand out more on stage, now with that mindset, when you go to an open mic, approach it with, oh, I'm going to try a new act out, or I'm going to try a new facial expression, or deliver this line differently. And you just kind of start to piece together how the audience is
mm,
reacting to certain things you do, and you can kind of build out a more physical performance like that. But it is all, I
yeah,
think it does all start with the intention,
yeah, and it's also like heaps more fun for you doing that as well,
Mm-hmm.
because if it, like yeah, the times when you'd be if you're gigging like 200-300 times a year, or whatever, and you're gonna say that line the same way 200-300 times. It's gonna
Right.
turn to ash in your mouth, right? Like whatever you want. You don't want that to happen, but it's what's gonna happen, right? Uh, Whereas the lovely thing is just like just say it a bit weird one day, like
Right.
give it a go, and like I really love still finding like new tags in old bits and stuff like that, or just like I'm gonna do it in this weird voice for no reason this one time,
Mm-hmm.
and it'll keep it alive for you. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah, give that a go there, Zach, and anyone else listening. The next question we have here from McGill. What do you think happened that took you from open mics to your next real step up?
I
Mm.
this is going to be a really infuriating answer because I asked. So this Pierre, who I was talking about last thing, I remember a conversation that we had a couple of years ago where I was just like, bro, do you remember how when you started, people would only let you do 5 minutes, and then it felt like no one would let you do 10 minutes until you'd already done 10 minutes, and then no one would let you do 20 until you'd already done 20, and no one would pay you until you'd already been paid, and no one would do like all of this. Like, there seemed to be an impossible thing of like getting to that, and it was like, but we clearly did, but I don't remember how
Yeah.
that how that happened. I was like, do you remember how it happened? And it was so annoying because he was just like, I think about this all the time
It's
because
like
I
we
don't
just didn't
remember
quit.
either.
Yeah. Just
Yeah,
kept going and it just kept climbing. Yeah.
yeah. Um, but it like it is a weird because I don't know if it's quite catch 22, but because you can find yourself in that situation where it feels like no one's going to give you the first opportunity to do the next thing, uh, even if you feel as though you are. And then at certain points, it could feel like someone opens a door and that you've been standing behind knocking at for 3 years. Like, oh, have you been here for long? And you're like, yeah, a bit. I've been here a while. uh, um, that I think like so much of it like must come down to sort of bullheaded persistence
Yeah.
in great part. Um, and also, I think that probably a lot of it comes from like just keeping writing stuff,
Mhm.
because you can feel like, all right, say when people are starting out and you're like, oh, but nothing. Well, I've got this really killer like 10-minute set that always does super well or does super well more often than not, and I'm getting like, and there are a few things that are really good, and then there's always the thing of like, yeah, but if you've been doing that for a super long time, um, then to an extent there will be not necessarily diminishing returns in the reaction that you're getting, but diminishing returns in what you can get out of it, right? And it won't, then you won't try and expand, I suppose.
So just yeah, it's staying persistent and also in the meantime creating your own opportunities as well. You know, if you're trying to get a step up, try to create your own step up, produce your own show, try to book a gig in an outside from your local town and kind of start building out your own opportunities that
Yeah.
way. But yeah, a lot of it is I love some of the answers to the questions are like just keep going and you'll find it as it goes. You know, there's comedy is
Yeah.
definitely a marathon. And I know with social media, it can feel like, oh, what's the hack? How do I go viral and then just jump the line? A lot of those people are outliers. And the reality is, there is something to just staying consistent and persistent and staying creative, like you said as well.
And there's like I remember there's a Mike Birbiglia bit about this, just about like how completely delusional like like everyone who begins doing stand up is
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah.
us
Mm-hmm.
both included, right? It's just like is part of it. Of course you're incredibly delusional to be doing this. And it's it's so difficult because also because it's so fun and you fall in love with it and it's the best thing when it goes well, and you can never really know the extent to which, yeah, am I like, is this working out, am I being mad attempting to do this, and you never know, you literally never
Yep.
know the answer to that. It's infuriating.
Mm-hmm. So let's try to run through a few of these in the last few minutes here.
Yeah.
But this is really kind of on the same lines from Megan Carroll asking if you ever wanted to quit stand-up, and if so, what kept you going?
I briefly thought that I wanted to sort of stay. This is a weird answer because it was mainly when I was coming towards the end of my degree, I thought that I might just want to stay in academia. And
Hmm.
then I didn't get accepted onto a master's. So, so that sort of put paid to that. So, so that's me at 21 being like, I'll show Oxford.
Right, yeah.
Look at me now.
I don't see Oxford on Netflix, I'll tell you that. That's hilarious.
um, but yeah, I don't like. I think that it's yeah, just from what because I was so young when I started it, it was the really fortunate thing of like, all right, it's not that I have a 10-year career behind me and I'm gonna try this thing out, and then needing to make decisions about, do I really go for this, even though that means loss of security in other things, and yeah, like I'm married now, what would that mean for sort of life and stability and that sort of thing. Whereas when you're starting something as a teenager, that sort of thing doesn't enter into the uh, sort of internal conversation, really. So I think that, yeah, to be honest, I never particularly thought that I like definitely wanted to stop. I mean, occasionally during periods of like serious clinical depression, but that's like that's more a medical reason rather than a like
Mm.
actual.
But I mean,
Don't know if
it's
that
funny you
counts.
even bring up. It's funny you even bring up that though, because that was a topic we have like going on in our Facebook group right now. Is someone named Joseph had posted about people struggling with clinical depression and how do you get on the other side of that.
Hmm.
So for you and your personal experience, do you have how have you been able to, with such an up and down journey and unstable journey comedy can be, and feeling that clinical depression, how do you get on the other side of
Yeah,
it?
I think that that's a difficult element of it because yeah, there's such inherent unpredictability to the way that sort of things end up going in in your professional life, and then part of it has to be like saying like, I guess I chose this, so gonna try and make it work. But it's a tricky thing to talk about because obviously even more so than stand up, this feels like the sort of experience where you really, really only have a sample size of one. So it doesn't seem the right as odd as I find giving advice about stand up. I would find giving advice about that sort of thing even even strange.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I just didn't know from your personal
Mm.
experience what has helped you, because that is a common
Yeah,
thing. I mean, mental health and comedy kind of go hand in hand.
yeah, I think so. Well, well, yeah, that certainly seems to be the case. I think for me it was sort of acknowledging what was happening at the times that it was happening, and uh, sort of often, you always are playing a bit of catch up with yourself emotionally, and then for me, medication during periods where it was necessary and helpful, which I've been off for a couple of years now, but to me was just as much about wanting to have almost a daily appointment with myself as a commitment to, I really want to feel different and I want to feel better. Um,
Hmm.
hmm,
Well, thank you for sharing that. Seriously, because it's not so funny and exciting of a topic, but it is something very common that I think a lot of people inside and outside of comedy go through. So yeah, I think professional help is your best friend. Therapy, I found therapy to be very helpful in many aspects of my life. So I think for anyone going through that, I think that's a great. We're neither of us are doctors. I mean, I hear almost was in academia, but we heard how that went. But it's
yes.
I think
Not a
professional
doctor,
help is your best
just
friend.
look like one.
So, so in the last few minutes here, I want to get to these last two questions. And someone in the comments roasted us saying we look like librarians talking about comedy. So that's pretty good. I usually get youth pastor. I'll get that one a lot. But librarians is a new one. That's good. So let's get to these last two questions. Chicken Joe Clark, what's your best advice for Americans wanting to perform overseas in the UK?
I think that really, that I genuinely think the Edinburgh Festival is absolutely amazing. Um, I think maybe it's pretty deep end to go straight into that, particularly if you want to do it for an extended period of time, and also it's super expensive if you're coming from abroad. There's obviously initial setup costs to a lot of these things, but I'd say in first port of call, like anyone who you know who's done it before, and if you come to, I mean, I would recommend everyone come to London, regardless of whether they're going to do stand-up. It's the greatest city that there is, was, and ever will be, right? And so, but it's also a wonderful place to do comedy. It's a wonderful place to watch comedy. I absolutely adore watching comedy in other countries. And watching people who are local to, or even in my own country, watching people who are local to that city in other places, because there's always a sort of distinct element to it anywhere you go. So I would say that, yeah, going to, it's like pretty much any capital city, right? You can go and try it out, give it a go. You may well know people who've done this before who might be able to give you some advice on places to go, spots to get. And then ultimately, as and when, I really would say that the Edinburgh Fringe is like awesome place to do stand up, and probably like it's a marathon of stand up, and there's nothing quite like it.
And this ties into our final question, actually, from Bobby Sutton, which is about festivals. With the entry costs of festivals rising every day, how does one know when they are ready to start submitting to them with a real shot at getting in?
Well, see, I think that this is where there's a distinction. So something like the Fringe is the reason it started in the first place was that it was the fringe of the Edinburgh Festival, so it was intentionally sort of open access to if you want to do it, you can do it, pretty much. Um, and but of course, like plenty of ones out there globally, as Bobby is saying, which are not like that. Um, I would say that probably at the beginning of all of these things, there is an element of calculated risk. And I don't think that anyone, like, take the experience of Edinburgh, for instance, right? Like, people get very bound up with every year there is an award for Best Newcomer. Right. And generally speaking, about 5 people are nominated for Best Newcomer. There might be 100 shows that are eligible, or maybe even more than that. I don't know. But people can get so in their heads about, oh, I want to have the perfect thing because I want to be eligible for this. And they might get it, they might not get it even. Like, it's, if you've got, yeah, you might have a more than 5% chance if you're bringing something with really great quality, and you'd hope that everyone was doing the best that they could in that sphere. But like, are you in the long run going to end up timing wise, like holding yourself back by being like, well, the first thing that I make has to be absolutely perfect, right? So of course, like, the cost element of it is always going to be a very relevant one. Like, don't make silly economic decisions, right? Like, that's I'm not an economist either, but I would advocate not making silly economic decisions. Because if you're if you're doing this for a living, like, fundamentally, like, you run a small business. It's just a weird one, right? It's like a weird one in which you are the product.
Yep.
And but you're sort of a delivery guy who goes to a place, drops off the package. The package just happens to be yourself, and then
Yeah.
you leave and go back to the place that you were from, right? And your
Oh, that's
life will
hilarious.
involve loads more accountancy and logistics than you ever thought possible.
Yep.
Right? But certainly putting acknowledging that one can't put that entirely to one side, putting it as to one side as you can, the financial element of it, probably artistically and professionally, there is inevitably going to be a degree of calculated risk you'll end up taking because I don't think that you ever feel ready. Right. Like, did you, the very first time you did stand up, did you feel like in the seconds before they were going to call your name, you're like, I got this in the bag?
Yeah, 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 yeah.
But I'm betting for everyone listening who did do it the first time and has continued to do it, it's because the first time went just well enough that you wanted to do it the second time, which went just well enough, etc. Um,
Yep.
and so we've all already taken the plunge once. Uh, you're probably gonna, in a certain like, it will feel a bit uncomfortable, but then I think that we're all sort of used to that as well.
Absolutely. Well, I hear you've done it, my friend. Thank you so much for hanging out with us here at the Hot Breath Verse. Of course, we want people go watch your Netflix special. It's called Ends. It's on Netflix. It's amazing. You will not be disappointed. And is there anything else you want the Hot Breath Verse to do to help support you, follow you, certain places, or to keep up with you? What anything else you'd like to promote here that we can help with?
Yeah, I mean, I'm now I am as of a few weeks ago on Instagram. So that is I am at
Mm.
Ahir Shah on the photograph website. And I have which is I'm sorry, I'm just trying to fit into the librarian ethos, but
Yeah,
even
yeah,
more so,
yeah.
I'm now excited that as we log off, I get to put my glasses back on, which
Yes.
I'd taken off from a glare perspective. But I think really, listen, librarian and youth pastor is the double act coming to a city near you.
Hilarious. That's amazing. You're like, I'm now on the social medias. I just
Yeah.
started. So, have you been doing comedy this long? You're like, I'm on Instagram now, everyone.
Yes. Well, I was on Twitter and I used Twitter a lot for several years, and then as I mean, I'm not going to be the first to break this news that it's a very upsetting place, and
Yeah.
therefore I was just like, hey, maybe just no social media, that'd be fine. And then people who tell me to do things told me to get Instagram, and I was like, do you know what? That's fair enough.
You're a business. That's part of
Yeah,
it now.
yeah.
So help Ahir's business. Go follow him on Instagram. Go watch his Netflix special. You will follow us on Instagram at Hot Breath Pod. We'll have content from this interview tagged on there. You can follow him from there. But Ahir, thank you so much for your valuable time, and I'm excited to see what you create next, man. This was amazing to connect with you.
Pleasure talking to you, Joel.
All right. Have a good day out there, Hot Breath Verse. We will see y'all next Tuesday on Hot Breath.